Now, Mr. Murray, you're at home, are you?
I am at home, yeah.
And you can hear and see me, that's obvious because you've answered.
Yeah, I can.
Are you there on your own?
I am there on my own. I have opened a window. If it causes any disturbance, let me know and I'll shut it, but it's quite warm in here.
Well, I think keep it open and we'll let you know. Now, you're talking to a room which has in fact 9 people in it at the moment, and that's at Fleetbank House in London. But the people you're really talking to are the 200, 250 thereabouts people beyond who are watching remotely and will be picking this up either on Zoom or on YouTube. So that's your audience. Ms. Richards will be asking you the questions, but first Mary will invite you to take the oath. In your case, the affirmation.
Please state your full name.
Alasdair James Murray.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely.
I do solemnly and sincerely.
And truly declare and affirm.
And truly declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Mr. Murray, you were appointed as a trustee of the Mcfarland Trust in March 2014. Is that right?
I think that's right. I think my first trustee board meeting was May, though, so I can't remember the precise appointment time.
Yeah, no, that's correct. And you took over as chair in May 2016 when Mr. Evans resigned.
That's correct.
And as I understand it, his resignation was unexpected, and the board decided, because there was uncertainty over the future of the trust by that stage, to appoint as chair one of the existing trustees.
That's certainly my understanding of the board's decision, which obviously wasn't mine.
You remained chair until the Mcfarland Trust wound up.
That's correct.
And your background was in journalism and public policy. Is this right, that between 2010 and 2019, you were director at Quiller Consultants, a public affairs and strategic communications consultancy?
That's correct.
So that was your employment whilst you were trustee at the Mcfarland Trust?
Yes, it was.
And you're now director of external affairs at KPMG?
That's correct.
Prior to your appointment in 2014 as a trustee of the Mcfarland Trust, did you have any knowledge or experience of the background to the blood contamination disaster or the institution of the Mcfarland Trust?
Not in any meaningful way.
And what led you to apply to become a trustee?
I was approached by a recruitment firm who were seeking new trustees, who so basically talked me through the Mcfarland Trust and suggested I go on and talk further with the chair and the CEO.
Did you receive, either at the appointment stage or once you took up your post as trustee, did you receive any induction materials or any training to give you a better understanding of the background?
As far as I recall, there were materials, but there was also a very thorough training briefing with the chair and the CEO. I was also introduced to a number of members of staff at that point.
If we look at MACF 5061_057, please. Now, these are the notes of a meeting not attended by you. It was the Mcfarland Trust Annual Review with the Department of Health from December 2014. But if we go just a little further down the page to paragraph 3A, it refers to the Mcfarland Trust having trustee vacancies and the board being pleased to appoint trustees with relevant skills and experience for the trust. And then you're identified at 3A2 and it says this: you have experience with parliamentary affairs and lobbying. What was the basis on which it was thought that that experience might be useful to the trust? Do you know?
So, I mean, you'd need to ask the trustees who appointed me at the time to be sure, but my feeling from informal conversations was that we were already entering a period where it was expected that government was going to be heavily involved in terms of the way the trusts and the trust more broadly were organised, and that it would be useful for someone who had some experience of Parliament and some experience of political affairs rather than lobbying to be involved. I would also say that my work was also around communications, principally external facing rather than internal, i.e. dealing with beneficiaries and staff, but there was a feeling it would be helpful in terms of where they were communicating with government in particular, if that I might have some useful skills.
And to what extent did you, either as trustee or chair, have to bring those skills to bear? What involvement did you have with Parliament or government over the following years?
So there was a fair degree of involvement. In fact, I think in my time as chair, arguably it was probably the largest part of my job, in the sense that government had begun the reform process that was going to lead eventually to the move to an HSBSA and also the closure of the trust in precise form to be decided. And that therefore a lot of what I was doing was dealing with that process and trying to ensure that it ran smoothly and effectively in the best interests of the beneficiaries.
We can take the document down, thank you. What did you understand in 2014 when you were appointed as trustee? What did you understand the principal role and function of the Mcfarland Trust to be at that point?
To provide fundamentally financial, but other assistance where it was deemed appropriate to the primary beneficiaries, but also to a much wider array of people who've been affected through the primary beneficiaries, including secondary beneficiaries, the dependents, the bereaved, and so on.
We've heard from other witnesses that the Mcfarland Board of Trustees had not participated in what might be called campaigning, had not taken a public role advocating or agitating for additional funding, but had preferred to make its requests for additional funding privately and directly to the Department of Health. Were you aware of that, and was that something you expressed any views about to your fellow trustees?
So, as far as I recall, I don't think there was ever a formal discussion about that in my time with the Mcfarland Trust. I think it was informally mentioned to me when I was in the joining process that this is the state, that the Mcfarland Trust was focused on its service provision and ensuring through that it could achieve the best deal possible.
If we go to your witness statement, WITN 3076002, please, Shomek. And if we go to page 6, if we pick up the top paragraph, which is paragraph 20 of your statement, it begins on the previous page, but I just want to look at the last couple of sentences. You say that during your time on the board there were no further appointments as trustee, and in the last two sentences you say, once it became clear in March 2017 that MFT would be closing, there would have been no purpose in recruiting additional trustees. And then you say this: had MFT not been closed, I think it would have been desirable to appoint additional trustees who had not served previously. Why would that have been your preference?
Because by the time it closed, there were quite an array of trustees who had served for a very long time, and in my experience and knowledge of governance, of charity governance, it is proper and fit that after 10, 12 years maximum, that there should be some changeover to bring fresh ideas and fresh interests onto a board to ensure it was going to continue to be effective.
We can take that down, thank you. Now you've said in your statement that you understood the Mcfarland Trust to be entirely independent from the Department of Health. Others have described the Mcfarland Trust effectively as an arm of government or an instrument of government, in large measure because of the dependence upon the Department of Health for funding. Do you have any observations or comments to make on that?
Well, this is a grey area. But this is true of all charities and funded bodies of this nature, that you can have governance independence, but of course, indirectly, there will always be some impact through your funders. Many organisations are lucky in having a vast array of funders, which reduces that impact. But clearly, when you've only got one funder, who is the Department of Health, there is some implicit impact, which doesn't affect its ultimate governance independence. And I think in my time, where we didn't have, as far as I understand it, Department of Health or other appointments, it didn't affect our ability to make independent decisions.
But is this right, that what the Mcfarland Trust could, in practice, do by way of service provision, financial assistance, was ultimately highly constrained by what the Department of Health allocated to it in terms of funding?
I think that's completely true.
During the time that you were either trustee or chair, do you recall the Department of Health trying to influence the Mcfarland Trust more directly in terms of how it should spend its limited allocation?
Not in terms of how it spent its money. I think that was respected, but that was the choice of the trust and the board.
Did you have any interactions with the Department of Health yourself directly prior to being appointed chair?
I don't think I attended a meeting before chair, but there may be a case that I did attend one in addition to, but I don't think so.
Once you became chair, can you tell us what kind of meetings or interactions you had with the Department of Health? Not expecting you to remember precise dates, but in terms of the nature of the interactions.
Yes, I think the main interaction was through the partnership group that was set up to help steer the financial reform process that the government was undertaking. I think I conducted one annual review meeting because there was actually only 1 year of budget that I was chair for, that an annual review meeting took place. I think that's largely it. I think there was an introductory meeting to a new Director General at one stage, who was, the ultimate person in response. There may, through that, also been a meeting that was directly connected to the NHS-BSc handover rather than the partnership group.
When you say partnership group, do you mean the reference group?
Reference group, apologies, yes, reference group.
Were any of your meetings or interactions with the Department of Health minuted, as far as you can recall?
We took an informal note and reported back to the board. I would have thought the reference group meetings were minuted. I can't see why they wouldn't be. I'm afraid I can't remember. There were officials in the room. It's normal for them to be minuted. So, but I think that you'd have to ask Department of Health.
You say in your witness statement, if we just put it back on screen, Shamik, sorry, WITN 3076002, and we go to paragraph 42. It's page 11, I think. Yes, so bottom of the page, you say this. During my time at the Trust, MFT made an annual request for funding based on our assessment of likely need. There were 2 repeated problems with the process. First, as previously noted, the trustees did not regard the amount allocated as sufficient to meet beneficiary need without using part of MFT's reserves. Now, before we come on to the second problem, in relation to that first problem, was it your understanding or experience that what was allocated by the Department of Health was not based upon any particular assessment of likely need, but essentially was simply, this is what we're willing to give you?
So I don't think that's quite fair in the sense that we made an assessment which suggested what we thought the full budget based on experience in previous years should be. I did feel that the Department of Health were aware of the reserves and then made an offer on the basis that they thought we could run down our reserves to cover the difference.
Was there ever, in your experience, any engagement by the Department of Health with the detail of your funding bids?
They certainly looked through and responded, normally in the form of a letter. So I believe they must have reviewed them. But I'm afraid you'd have to ask them to what extent and how detailed that actually was.
And then the second problem you identify, you say this second, as far as I can recall, in most financial years, the government did not confirm our funding allocation until the new financial year had started, which created uncertainty about whether we would have the funding necessary to deliver the support we planned to provide to beneficiaries, and absent the reserves could have posed cash flow problems. Did you take that up with the department, that particular issue?
It was taken up, in my experience, every year. I mean, as I said, I think I only had 1 year when I was chair that I actually went through this process. And that was a particularly difficult year because by that stage we knew the transfer was going to happen to an HBSA. And we were in a position where at one point they wanted us to use the reserves basically first before giving us an allocation. So we pushed back very strongly on that, and that was not the outcome we achieved. My understanding is there was, a regular exchange over the period between the annual review and the beginning of the new financial year between the chief executive and probably previous chairman and the Department of Health about the need to get this resolved.
And just so that we can complete the factual picture, we'll look at such information as we have about the one review meeting that you attended. Shomik, it's MACF 5061_050. We'll see it's a letter from you dated the 10th of February 2017 to Ailsa Wright at the Department of Health. And the first paragraph reads, at the annual review meeting which Jan Barlow and I attended with you on the 16th of January 2017, you advised us that MFT would continue to be operational going into 2017-18 and that we would most likely be given allocations on a quarterly basis because of the uncertainty about the procurement timetable. You also advised us that you were minded to reduce MFT's allocation for 2017-18 as a way of forcing MFT to use up its reserves. Just pausing there, Mr. Murray, we've explored the issue of the reserves with a number of other witnesses, including your two predecessors as chair. What was your understanding, if any, when you joined the board of why it was the trust still had substantial reserves that it hadn't expended?
My understanding is the reserves dated back to a period where the funding was very different. It wasn't an annual fund, it was a lump sum, and therefore some of this capital had remained in place. That over time, the nature of that funding changed. We moved to an annual fund, and that caused the issue of what should be done with the reserves to run those down.
If we look at the bottom of this page, we can see you refer to, in the last paragraph, to the special grants programme run by the Trust in 2013-14. I'll come back to that at a later stage. If we go over the page, in the last long paragraph, second half of the page, beginning as we have discussed, you set out, I think, a concern of a cliff edge. You say, we're determined to ensure there's no cliff edge where available funding is dramatically reduced. This objective has inevitably been complicated by the fact that the timetable for change has been delayed repeatedly. In light of the information you've shared with us, the board considers it would not be prudent to be forced into a position of using up all its reserves in the immediate future when the period of time it will continue to operate is so poorly defined. What was the particular concern you and the chief executive and the board had at this time?
Well, the fact that the financial reform process, which in turn was leading to the structural reform process, had repeated false starts, missed deadlines. There was a move initially, for example, to go out to procurement. The government then paused this, then completely changed its mind, came up with the NHS BSA article. I think this letter was probably just before that was done. I think it's written when it was in a pause period. And we had no confidence that the government was going to be able to meet its timetable. I mean, there are other factors at play, like the judicial review. Again, I'm not quite sure where this letter sits in that timetable, but it was just causing the government to frequently stop and start again. In fact, that went further back, because you can go back to 2015, when an initial move, a suggestion from the Prime Minister that there was going to be a change in funding and the amount of funding was stopped because of the general election.
Was that the announcement by David Cameron after the Penrose report? There was a £25 million announcement. I was going to ask you about that, but it might be a convenient point at which to do it now. So that funding, did the MFT have any advanced knowledge of that announcement?
None that I'm aware of, although I was not chair at the time.
Is this the correct way to understand your evidence that is this right? None of that £25 million, in fact, came to the Mcfarland Trust?
No, I don't think that's correct. I mean, it would be difficult to do a forensic trace through from that announcement to the ultimate outcome. What was clear was that there was going to be a big change in the way financial support was provided. At that point, it hadn't been exactly decided how.
And then, just then returning to the January 2017 annual review, can we go to MACF 5027_088? These are the private and confidential part of the minutes of a meeting held on the 30th of January 2017. I'd just ask this, Mr. Murray, if we go down the page, there's a discussion on MFT loans and advances, but then we can see there's a discussion about discretionary top-up payments, which isn't concerned with individual beneficiaries. And then if we go over the page, you'll see the heading halfway down the page, additional information regarding government reforms. I'm going to ask you a bit about that in a moment. But why does this kind of discussion appear in the private and confidential part of the minutes?
I think it was, this was a practice established before I joined as either a trustee or a chair. I think it was to allow trustees to have a full sense of debate around something that was very sensitive in terms of the difficulties of the relationship with the Department of Health, and to reach a position where it could then report back to the Department of Health its position. I would assume that is the reason.
Was that not something that beneficiaries would be entitled to be fully informed about?
I think there were ways that beneficiaries were informed about ongoing discussions. I would need to think through fully. I wasn't aware that it was a particular issue at the time. I think it would have been difficult for us to maintain a running commentary in detail before we were able to make a clear decision on what our approach to the Department of Health was, that clearly was going to go into the public domain.
If we go to the top of the next page. Actually, sorry, we'll just pick it up at the bottom of the previous page. My apologies, Shomik. So we can see in the last paragraph, JB, that's Miss Barlow, reported that she and AM, so you, Mr. Murray, had attended the annual MFT review meeting with DH on the 16th of January 2017. At the meeting, Elsa White confirmed that the Alliance House entities would continue to operate for at least part of 2017-18, although she'd given contradictory messages as to the length of time they would do so. She'd also indicated that officials would be exploring with Lord O'Shaughnessy the extent to which he was committed to the procurement going ahead. So that would suggest, you're right, Mr. Murray, that the point in time at which this meeting occurred was the pause in the procurement process. And I'm going to ask you about that in a little while. And then this first main paragraph, JB and AM had been advised that MFT would be given allocations on a quarterly basis for 2017-18. AM, so this is you, reported that Ailsa White had made it very clear that DH intended to reduce MFT's allocation as a way of forcing it to use up reserves. This was very concerning, as she clearly did not understand the current level of reserves that MFT held, in spite of JB attempting to clarify the figures with her. She had also not remembered that MFT had been implementing a planned reduction of reserves in recent years, and then the board goes on to express concern at the prospect of DH reducing the allocation or withholding funds. Do you have any additional recollection of that meeting or of the matters that are set out here, in which you've reported your concerns about the Department of Health's lack of understanding?
No, I do think the CEO and I were a little frustrated, given that the running down of reserves to fill the hole had been a thing for a number of years. That we had a clear reserves policy set out in our annual report, which is in line with Charity Commission guidance. That this didn't seem to have occurred, and there seemed to be an assumption in the Department of Health that there were much more in the reserves than was actually the case. And it was certainly the case that, if we'd been forced just to go to reserves, I mean, who knows, it would have been a very close thing of us running entirely out of money before the move over would have been made. But at that point, we didn't even know when the move was likely to be made. And
then if we go to a letter from the Department of Health to you at MACF 5061_049. We can see it's a letter from Ailsa White to you, 7th of March 2017. Second paragraph says, I understand your concerns, particularly during this time of uncertainty. We expect that the current schemes will continue in their current form until the end of September 2017. We'll continue to provide funding to the schemes until the new scheme administrator is established. And then we're not currently in a position to confirm the funding allocation for 2017-18, as we are waiting for the departmental budgets to be finalised. As soon as we're told, we will issue the allocation letters. I appreciate this is difficult in terms of timing and planning. As you know, we are rarely able to confirm the allocations in advance of the financial year. Is that what your understanding of what had been the pattern previously as well?
Yeah, absolutely. That is my understanding, that this was a common problem. I mean, it should be noted, of course, that it may not have sat just that with that department, that it may have been higher up the chain in government in terms of overall allocations.
We can take that down, thank you. Did you have any contact during your time, either as trustee or perhaps more likely as chair, with any of the devolved administrations?
I don't think I did directly. It is the case that probably before I was chair, but again, I would need to check the timing, that the Scottish scheme, separated in any case, probably around the time I took over as chair. But no, I didn't have any direct contact with the devolved administrations.
So I think funding was until Scotland, as it were, set up its own scheme, had been received from the devolved administrations. But was it your understanding that that funding went to the Department of Health, and then the Department of Health made an allocation to you that you would draw down on?
I'm afraid I couldn't confirm, but I do not recall any discussion of that issue in the meetings I attended, which does suggest that it was all wrapped up into one single budget allocation by the Department of Health, but I can't confirm that.
And if we go to MACF 5045_001, this is the annual financial report for the year ending 31st of March 2016. If we go to page 3, we can see in the first paragraph under the heading Chairman's Statement that this is your first statement as chair following your appointment in May 2016. If we go over the page, please, Shomik. Second paragraph says this: during 2015-16, the Scottish Government established a review group to examine the financial support provided to those infected in Scotland and their families. In March 2016, the Scottish Government announced it would be adopting the recommendations made by the review group to increase financial support to those infected in Scotland. The model of support which has been adopted for Scotland is considerably more generous than that which currently exists in the rest of the UK, and the payments are greater than those announced for England. At the time of writing, it's not known which model of support Wales and Northern Ireland will adopt. However, there will no longer be a unified system of support across the UK. To your knowledge, had the Mcfarland Trust or anyone on the Board of Trustees or Chief Executive participated at all in the Scottish Government's review group or been asked to supply information to it?
So I do recall some discussion of their review. I don't recall whether anybody had participated in it. I'm afraid we would need to go back through the minutes to confirm or not that.
I think the new Scottish Infected Blood Support scheme began, I think, on the 1st of April 2017. We have it as a matter of record. I hope I've got that right. Is it correct that there was then therefore a period of time in which the Mcfarland Trust was administering payments to Scotland or to Scottish beneficiaries, which were higher than the payments it was administering to beneficiaries in other parts of the UK?
I think it was the case before that was transferred out into, I think it ended up in the Scottish equivalent of the NHS BSA, but I think there was a period of transition before that took place. Exactly how long, I'm afraid I can't remember.
Did you have, as far as you can recall, any direct dealings with the representatives of the devolved administrations in either Wales or Northern Ireland either?
No, I did not.
We can take that down, thank you. We'll turn then to the question of contact with or involvement with beneficiaries. Did you have any regular contact with or meetings or involvement with beneficiaries during your time either as trustee or chair?
There were some contact and meetings. I would not define it as regular.
So in what kind of circumstances did contact take place?
So I had to attend one or two all-party parliamentary groups. There was some communication on difficult issues, and I also attended a meeting at an MP's office with a beneficiary.
Why was there no more regular or frequent interaction between you as chair and the beneficiary communities?
Because the regular and frequent action was undertaken by the CEO and the staff team. I was a chair, a charity chair, and non-executive chair. I was available for direct communication when there were issues that involved the staff team or needed to go above it. But I think this is a very normal way to run a charitable organisation.
I think we know that previously there had been some participation in the operation of the Mcfarland Trust through something called the Partnership Group, but that ceased in around 2014. Was anything, to your knowledge, put in its place to ensure, if not directly meetings with you, some form of direct interaction or participation by beneficiaries or representatives of the beneficiary community in the Mcfarland Trust's operations?
I think there were a number of ways the Mcfarland Trust communicated with beneficiaries. There was almost constant communication in terms of the financial support. There was an annual census. There was frequent communication via newsletters. There was a website. We also had user trustees on the board who were able to give an overview of what they were hearing and their own position. I think it was felt that, it was almost daily contact with the beneficiaries. I think it was felt, my understanding, and the partnership group ceased before I joined the board, that they'd have just not been very effective, and there were other ways to get the same kind of information.
Did you have any dealings yourself with the Haemophilia Society during your time as either trustee or chair of the Mcfarland Trust?
I had some limited dealings. As I recall, I think they attended one or two of the APPG meetings that I also attended. They were also members of the reference group that I attended.
In terms of the decision making on payments and grants by the Mcfarland Trust, would you agree, as a matter of principle, that it was important that the Mcfarland Trust's approach should be transparent, fair and consistent?
Indeed.
Are you able to assist with what steps were taken by the Mcfarland Trust to secure that?
So again, I think important steps were taken before I joined the board in terms of redoing the grants policy. I understand that a summary of that policy was available and shared with beneficiaries. I think in terms of the board, the way we held the staff team to account, there were very clear metrics. They would demonstrate that they were meeting expectations around delivery of grants in terms of times. We were aware of quantum as well. There was a sort of a data board that was taken to meetings. And then there was an appeal system when people were unhappy with the outcomes.
If we look at MACF 40/171_042, please. So these are grants guidelines for 2014-15, produced in around May 2014, as you'll see from the date there, which is, I think, around the time of your first trustee meeting. If we go on to page 3, please. You'll see in the first paragraph under the heading Introduction, second sentence, that this is intended for internal use only. It will not be distributed to beneficiaries. And if we go to the next page, without taking you through it in detail, you'll see from this, Mr. Murray, it sets out a number of specific respects in which grants can be awarded, and what a maximum amount that could be, I think, permitted by the office staff would be, and it sets out what the applicant must send in relation to each of these. Now, I just want to then next take you to what was published by the Mcfarland Trust, and then ask you about it. So if we go to MACF 40/171_049, you'll see here, Mr. Murray, what was published was something much shorter. It identifies under the heading application criteria some very broad areas where grants could be made. It sets out areas where grants will not be funded. And if we go over the page, it provides some basic information about the process and appeals. Why not simply publish the full office guidelines?
I'm afraid I don't know. I was aware that guidelines existed. I wasn't aware that there was a big gap between the two. I can speculate, but I don't have any formal knowledge of it. As far as I recall, it was never an issue that was raised or discussed in detail during my period actually on the board.
If we go in this document to the bottom of the first page, please, Shomik. And see at the very bottom of the page, under the heading Making an Application, the last paragraph, it says, as a charity, the trust is required to be able to demonstrate charitable need, and as such consider whether someone applying for a grant has the ability to fund it from their own resources. This is why we ask for details of income and expenditure when grant requests are made. Now, I don't think you were on the grants committee, Mr. Murray, is that right? But from time to time, presumably appeals came before the board in which they would have had to themselves consider these matters?
They did. As I recall, they were pretty infrequent to come to the board, but I think one or two did during my time.
What was your understanding, either as trustee or indeed as chair, as to how the decision makers, whether it's the board or the grants committee or indeed the office staff, how they were supposed to assess whether charitable need existed?
I mean, there was an application form, and there were the guidelines which were supposed to marry them up, and then they made an assessment in the grants committee of whether it met the guidelines, and this was backed up by a charitable need. That was my understanding.
But in terms of considering whether the applicant, has the ability to fund from their own resources, you might have had a form which had the household income and the basic outgoings. But in terms of the judgment as to whether it was reasonable to expect the applicant to fund something themselves, are we right in understanding that there were no specific guidance for decision makers in relation to that? It was simply an individual judgment in every case?
Without having read the guidelines in detail, I wouldn't be able to answer that. It didn't feel, as I say, there were few appeals to reach there, and in my memory, the most common reason was about scope, or where unfortunately, there needed to be quotes, and people had struggled to get theirs, and there was some reason why they wished to speed up that procedure. But I remember very few coming up, and I remember, I can't remember a case where there was an assessment of need in this sense, done at board level.
In terms of the annual census, could we look at MACF 5027_088? We look at the very bottom of the page. Sorry, these are the minutes of a meeting on the 30th of January 2017. Again, it's partly of the minutes. In fact, it's the same minutes that we looked at previously. But if we look at the last paragraph on this page, you'll see reference there to the annual census that was usually carried out to review household income and therefore eligibility for discretionary top-up payments. And then in relation to the year 2016-17, because of uncertainty as whether MFT would still be in existence for the entire financial year, it had been agreed that the annual census should not be carried out in full, but the beneficiaries should be written to, advising them to contact MFT if their financial circumstances have changed over the last 12 months. Now, is this right that prior to this decision, all beneficiaries had to, if they wished to be considered for any form of assistance, had to complete a census every year, even if their circumstances had not changed at all?
That would imply it was the case. I'm afraid I can't answer whether that happened every year or whether there are other years where that wasn't done. But also, those minutes imply this was specifically for discretionary top-up payments. So presumably, if you didn't want the top-up payment for whatever reason, you didn't have to do the census, but could still apply for other assistance. Did
the board, in the time you were a trustee or chair, ever consider whether the census scheme was imposing an unnecessary burden on beneficiaries?
I don't remember that ever being raised as an issue.
During your time as, we can put that away, thank you. During your time as trustee or chair, did the Mcfarland Trust negotiate, amend or cancel any secured or unsecured loans that you can recall?
I believe there were a couple of occasions where that happened. And I think with unsecured loans, particularly in the wind-up process, there was a review and it was felt they were unsustainable, so needed to be cancelled.
And was there any policy or any guidance or criteria as to the circumstances in which that would happen?
I think they were done on a case-by-case basis, but it was assessed whether the reasons for the cancellation were, I believe, purely about the recoverability and whether it was viable, much as any other loan issuing organisation would assess.
Now, I want to ask you next about the APPG report, which was January 2015. if we go to MACF 5022_012, this is a report from the Chief Executive to the Board of Trustees. If we look at the second paragraph, Ms Barlow says this in the third line: the report is nowhere near as bad as it could have been. And if we then go to MACF 5022_048, these are the minutes of a board meeting 26th of January 2015, and under the heading Political Developments, you'll see Mr Evans inviting comments on the actual report, and then there are contributions from MG, and then in the last sentence you're recorded as saying this: AM felt that the report was as good as could have been expected in the circumstances. Now that might suggest that you and or Ms Barlow and or others thought that there were more critical findings that could legitimately have been reached. Was that the case? Why did you express yourself in these terms?
I can't speak for the full Chief Executive, but what I would have understood that she said is what I certainly was saying, which is this kind of APPG report, of which I'd had some experience, is a political report. There are good quality and bad quality political reports of this nature, and this was a good quality report that had tried very hard to look right across the range of issues and consider recommendations to make things better, and we broadly supported that. You know, it was equally possible that the report could focus and put political pressure on one or two organisations or one or two individuals, and it didn't do that.
If we go to the report itself, so RLIT 5031, and if we then go, please, show me to page 9. Bottom of the page, I'm not going to go through, obviously, anything like the full report, Mr. Murray, but if we look here, we can see 5 points regarded by the two MPs who produced the foreword and who were co-chairs of the APPG as being worthy of particular emphasis. Many trust beneficiaries are in poverty, and then over the page, the worst form of modern day begging that I know of, and we can see if we just look in the text there, about 4 lines down, many respondents to our survey find the whole process highly demeaning and onerous. Some have been reduced to tears because of it. And then we see in the next paragraph, left in the dark, again picking it up 4 lines into where it might be more relevant to the Mcfarland Trust. Even those who do successfully register with the charities report about being left in the dark about support available to them. I won't trouble you with the other 2 bullet points, which are perhaps more structural issues. And then there is elsewhere in the report beneficiaries' views recorded that they didn't know why applications were refused, they weren't kept informed about the progress of applications, they felt driven to give up on making applications because of the process. There's a particular comment about the Mcfarland Trust getting worse, staff becoming more distant, and so on. What, if anything, did the Mcfarland Trust do in response to those parts of this report which either recorded criticisms of the Mcfarland Trust's processes or set out beneficiaries' experiences of the Mcfarland Trust which were negative and critical?
I don't think there was a specific response, but I think there's a bit more context to this, which is that my understanding, having only recently joined, was that much of this related to an earlier period, people's experience from before, and that there had been considerable effort to improve. And you see, for instance, the grant guidelines from 2014. So it wasn't strictly reflecting the immediate period prior to, at this point. My understanding too is that, whilst it's definitely reflected some people's views of beneficiaries, it was certainly not beneficiaries' views of the way the trust was acting. It was certainly not reflective of the majority. And I think that is reflected elsewhere in the survey. And it was almost immediately apparent that the government was going to change the way financial was given. And in particular, we felt it needed to look again at the charitable issue. The fundamental problem was structural, which is, as a charity, we were forced to have a means test around it.
So is it right to understand from your answer that for whatever reason, and you've suggested some, the Mcfarland Trust didn't itself take any specific action in response to the report?
There wasn't a formal action plan drawn up, no.
Does that not give you any cause for concern?
I think, here we are with the benefit of hindsight. As I said, there were contextual reasons that are missing from this board summary. And the other fact is that time moved very quickly, and very quickly it was apparent that the Mcfarland Trust would not be giving out money in the way it had been giving it out in previous years in the near future. But yes, if you stop the clock at that moment and I went back, I would say we should probably have examined this in more detail.
If we go next then, so if we move from 2015 in the APPG report to 2016 and the government's consultation, if we go to CAXT 5094_121, this is a joint response from the Alliance House organisations to the Department of Health's 2016 consultation. If we look at the second paragraph, we can see it says, we're acutely aware of the fact that the people we support have a very wide range of views about the existing organisations and any new scheme. It would therefore be impossible for us to respond at a very detailed level to the consultation in a way that would be representative of the beneficiary/registrant community as a whole. It would also be impossible for us to propose an alternative model of future support which would be seen as acceptable to the entire beneficiary/registrant community. We are therefore focusing our response to the consultation on what we consider to be the broader issues contained in the proposals. And it said that references then made to many years' experience of supporting individuals and some feedback following the launch of the consultation. Would it be right to understand that, perhaps for the reasons set out there, but as a matter of fact, there was no involvement of the beneficiary community in the, or no direct involvement of the beneficiary community in the preparation of the Alliance House organisation's response?
It's set through the user trustees who are very involved. It would be correct, yes.
And if we go in this same document to page 7, under the heading Organisational Model, the document says this, picking it up in the second line, we are aware that the Alliance House organisations have been the subject of ongoing criticism from a small minority of beneficiaries, notably those active in campaigning. However, we also work with a large number of beneficiaries/registrants who are very happy with the support they receive from us, and references made then to positive feedback. The canard that the existing organisations are not fit for purpose has been initiated and adopted by a minority whose complaints are really about the schemes that the organisations operate and the funding available for these rather than the organisations themselves. Do you consider that to be a fair and accurate reflection of the nature of the criticism that had been directed at the Alliance House organisations, that it was simply a small minority of beneficiaries active in campaigning?
Looking back on this, I think there could have been more reflection about meeting some of the criticisms and improving the processes, as my previous answer intimated. But I think overall, the point that was being made was that the charities were working very hard within constraints of the funding they have and their charitable nature to try and supply the best deal they could to beneficiaries, and that actually the real problem was the nature of the funding and the nature of doing this through charitable vehicles. Of course, it should be said by this stage, MFET was in operation, so there was some support already that was non-discretionary available to some beneficiaries.
Now, if we just move on in the course of 2016 to MACF 5027_075. These are the Part B of the minutes of a meeting 31st of October 2016. If we go a little further down the page, so we just have so we see the first paragraph under the heading additional information regarding item 84916 government reforms. We can see their reference to the Alliance House Boards engaging a specialist company to assist with the bid writing and submission, and you, Mr. Pond and Ms. Barlow, had interviewed companies, decided to appoint a particular one. Is this correct, Mr. Murray, that the Alliance House organisations decided that they would participate in the procurement process and put in a bid for essentially an Alliance House run single scheme?
That's correct.
What did the Mcfarland Trust, and if you're able to assist through discussions with others, the other Alliance House organisations, why did you think that that's something that you would be able to deliver and deliver successfully?
I mean, the Alliance House organisations had extensive experience of delivering. They were, constantly in contact with beneficiaries and aware of needs. And in terms of getting payments out, and again, point to the fact that MFET was by this stage a considerable part of the financial support in place for many beneficiaries. We're used to doing this process. In discussions with the Department of Health, we were not discouraged. In fact, I would say we were encouraged to consider applying. Clearly, if the Department of Health had said, absolutely not, there's no chance the criteria will not be suited, we would not have considered it.
And then is this right? We can take that down, thank you. That the procurement process was then, as it were, put on pause or delayed. And then, so no bid was actually submitted?
No bid was actually submitted. I'm not aware a bid was even written.
And then, I think in March 2017, the decision was taken by the Department of Health not to proceed with the procurement process and to transfer, in terms of the England, the support scheme to NHS BSA.
That's correct.
Did the Mcfarland Trust, or anyone in it, including yourself, have any involvement in that decision-making process? Were you consulted at all?
None at all. I was informed as chair by the minister on the day it was announced.
And were you informed who within the department had taken that decision?
I understood it to be the minister. The minister was still new in post, and that was the reason why the original procurement, one of the reasons I think the original procurement was paused, and that my understanding was that minister reappraised the situation and came up with this as a solution.
And if we go to MACF 5027_089, these are the minutes of a Board of Trustees meeting 27th of March 2017. If we go to page 2, top of the page, we can see a heading, Meeting with Minister, 6th of March 2017. JB advised the Board that a meeting with the Minister had been arranged for the afternoon of the 6th of March, but on the day, the Minister had asked to speak with herself and the 3 chairs individually on the telephone that morning. During the course of the telephone discussions, the Minister had announced the launch of the consultation and the fact that DH had decided to appoint NHS Business Services Authority as the new scheme administrator. So was that the very first that you knew of it?
Yes.
And did you gain either from the conversation you had then with the minister, or through any subsequent dealings you had, whether with the reference group or otherwise, did you gain any understanding of the reason that the minister had decided to change course and rather than proceed with the procurement process to set up the NHS BSA scheme?
I don't recall the minister giving a full explanation. It was presented as a very politely and nicely as a done deal. I can hazard a number of reasons, speculate why this was chosen, but I don't think I've got any firm evidence for my view.
So just noting the time, I've got some questions now on the reserves and the transfer to the Terrence Higgins Trust, which are important questions. If acceptable to you, sir, and Mr. Murray, it might be most sensible for me to complete my questions now and then take a break. It'll be a slightly later break and longer afternoon, but that will allow core participants at that stage to suggest any further questions. Otherwise, we'll have to take 2 breaks.
Yes, how long will you be, do you think? Roughly?
No more than half an hour.
Okay, well, let's do that.
Famous last words. I want to come on then to ask you about what was then done with the reserves, Mr. Murray. And I'm going to look at 2 aspects of what was done. The grants programme, what was called the time-limited grants programme, and then the transfer to the Terrence Higgins Trust. So if we can pick it up, MACF 5027_107, please. Minutes of a meeting on the 31st of July 2017. We've got the heading Future of the Mcfarland Trust. We go further down the page. We can see 4 options set out there for using the reserves post-transfer. Option 1, distribution to beneficiaries through a targeted time-limited grants programme administered by MFT, at the end of which the trust will be wound up. Option 2 is the same but administered by a third party. Option 3, continue to run down the trust, refocusing its work and perhaps using the reserves as an endowment fund. Option 4, merger with another appropriately focused charity. Now, I think the decision we can see at the bottom of the page, last 5 lines, after discussion, it was agreed to pursue the first option of distributing the bulk of the reserves through a targeted time-limited grants programme administered by MFT. Following this, any remaining reserves will be given to a third-party charity for distribution in line with fixed criteria. So that's July 2017. Was there any consultation with the beneficiary community about what you should do with the reserves?
There wasn't a direct discussion. There was, however, input from our user trustees who were very much aware of it. But this was seen as very much a 2-phase thing, which is firstly to do this option and then reconsider when we saw how much money was left as to what to do with the remainder.
If we then go to MACF 5028_006, so the document we looked at with minutes at July 2017, we're now March 2018. This is a report from the Chief Executive and Director of Operations to the Board of Trustees. We go to the second paragraph. We can see it says beneficiaries were written to in the first week of January 2017. That must, I think, be a mistake. It's 2018. And were given until the 26th of February 2018 to complete and return their application forms, along with at least 2 quotes for work required. Beneficiaries were informed the Trust would also consider grants towards work that had already been carried out. So just in terms of the timing, from the preliminary decision in July of 2007, it appears that beneficiaries weren't then contacted for some roughly 6 months or so, and then given only a few weeks to complete and return their application forms. Why those timings, which wouldn't give beneficiaries very much time to get themselves organised?
Firstly, I think the deadline there was aspirational to encourage beneficiaries to return, and I think, in fact, there was a much longer process in the end to enable as many people as possible to participate fully. What you have to remember is from July to November, the Trust had to basically transfer almost its entirety over to NHS BSA, and that was the focus. And in terms of the amount of money that was going to come from NHS BSA, it was very, very important that was going to be done correctly. So, I mean, we were a small organisation that simply couldn't do everything all at once. And then by the time that changeover was completed, we'd lost most of our staff. It went smoothly as far as I can remember, which was really, really important because that was where the regular money and other money was going to come from in the future. But then we only had 2 members of staff who also had responsibility for winding down all the other trusts and organisations within the Alliance House group as well.
And then if we look at the nature of the grants programme, well, we can see if we just go up the page. Sorry, to the top of the page. We can see from the heading of the document subject, specialist equipment and health and mobility related repairs and improvements to property grants. Can you recall why the one-off grant programme to use up reserves was focused upon health and mobility related repairs, property and specialist equipment? There'd already been a reserves programme in 2013-14 which was property based.
As I recall, there was an analysis paper presented by the staff which concluded that this would be the most effective way to use the reserves, that these were large, likely to be large grants that were not going to be available under the new NHS BSA system, and would be perhaps the best way to get as much of the money out of the reserves in this period.
Was any consideration given to perhaps running alongside it a further grants programme which could perhaps be more directly pitched at the bereaved community?
I can't remember if that was discussed.
And then if we look at MACF 5028_018, these are minutes from January 2018, and an update is being provided. If we just go further down the page, it'll show it. Under the heading Mcfarland Trust Reserves Grant, if you look at the second paragraph, JB advised the team had heard from various sources beneficiaries were intending to boycott the grants programme. Questions have been raised regarding the application form, and some had claimed that it was too onerous to fill in. However, the form was the same as had been used previously and followed the same information requirements as had previously been used for standard grant applications. Now, bearing in mind that the APPG report revealed people being concerned about the onerous nature of applications, why was the decision taken just to use the same form, which we see then give rise to the concern expressed here, rather than adapting something that could be applied for more simply and straightforwardly?
I'm afraid that's a question for the Chief Executive and the staff team. I do not recall that discussion. I would add, though, that deadline, as I say, was aspirational, and I know the staff team worked very hard to ensure that everybody who wanted to apply could apply.
Now, I don't think we have necessarily a clear and precise figure for the amount that was dispensed under the grants programme. It was somewhere between, I think, £400,000 and £650,000, but that left, as I understand it, a significant amount of money by way of reserves. Is that right?
It left a reserve pot, yes.
So we can take the document down. And that reserve pot was transferred to the Terrence Higgins Trust.
Mm-hmm.
Before I ask you to look at a couple of documents, what's your recollection of why the decision was taken to transfer the assets of the Mcfarland Trust to the Terrence Higgins Trust?
As I recall, there was more money than perhaps we hoped left. Therefore, with the decision made to transfer to a third party, we were looking for an organisation that understood the issues, had a track record of helping in this area, and we felt would be willing and able to take on the reserves, because obviously we put a restriction on it, and many charities would not necessarily be able to do that.
Why not distribute the remaining reserves directly to beneficiaries rather than why transfer it at all to a third-party organisation?
At that point, we were under intense pressure to shut down, which was partly resource connected. We were going to lose our office. We were almost out of staff time and DH funding to finish the process of winding down. So it was felt there wasn't time to run another programme. And by transferring, of course, the money doesn't disappear. The money is still there. And as far as I understand, is still available for beneficiaries at this time.
Is it correct that there was no consultation with beneficiaries in connection with the decision to transfer to the Terrence Higgins Trust?
It is correct. It was discussed. Again, it was felt there were time pressures that we could not undertake a meaningful consultation. I remember there was also discussion, and it was felt unlikely that we would achieve consensus, and that there would be, people who would be critical, no matter what form of winding down the reserves and passing them on we undertook.
Was there any consultation or discussion with the Department of Health about the proposal to transfer either in principle to a third-party organisation or specifically to the Terrence Higgins Trust?
The Department of Health were informed of our plans, but there was no discussion or consultation about it.
What about the other devolved nations who would have contributed to the pot that made up the reserves? Was there any discussion or information provided to them?
Not to the devolved nations, but there was a discussion about the fact that they had contributed and this money should be available to all the devolved nations as well as England.
Was any legal advice taken as to whether it would be within the powers of the Board of Trustees to allocate the money without requiring specific grants if there wasn't time for a further grant programme, allocate the money to the beneficiary community?
There was legal advice taken throughout the winding down process. I cannot remember if the specific advice was issued on that issue. I would also point to there is a precedent here, which is MFET, which in my understanding have been set up to make non-discretionary payments because they could not be made through a charity.
I can take you to the document if need be, but the Eileen Trust funds were, according to the documentation, apportioned amongst beneficiaries, not necessarily with everybody receiving an identical amount, but apportioned according to an understanding of need. Why could that course not have been taken with the Mcfarland Trust beneficiaries?
If there was an apportionment of need, then it was potential for that to be done. But again, I would point you to the timetable we had. That would have been a considerable process, not least, as you remarked, that money had been accrued over 30 years. It was not just geographically devolved nations involved, but also all our beneficiaries and their dependents, bereaved, etc. We would need to contact them and to organise a system that was fair and effective, and that would have taken some considerable period of time.
You would have known, would you not, from March 2017 that this was something that might need to be done? Was there not the time at least to explore with beneficiaries how they might want to have these monies expended?
I think with hindsight that we had a very strict process for winding up all the Alliance House organisations. That then meant in the end we had too little time to consult fully enough at the end. And I think with hindsight it would have been better to have reworked that process. But it was a process that it was problematic there rather than the outcomes.
And was any consideration given to the particular sensitivities that might arise from transfer to the Terrence Higgins Trust in circumstances where those originally infected in the 1980s had been subjected to horrific stigma through HIV? Was any consideration given to how beneficiaries might react, or any concerns they might have?
This issue was discussed, but there were 2 points raised about it. Firstly, there was a history of working with Terrence Higgins in the past. This was not a new thing. And secondly, Terrence Higgins itself precisely works in this area of dealing with the stigma of HIV, and therefore was a great organisation for dealing with that issue.
And then if we just go to your witness statement, please, Mr. Murray, WITN 3076002. Shame my version's not paginated, but it's 6 pages or so from the end, if that helps. Paragraph 123. We go on to the next page. Thank you. So we can see at the bottom, in paragraph 123, you say this: I'm asked to comment on the time-limited grants programme, and then if you go over the page, as recorded in the minutes of the board meeting on the 31st of July, 4 options were discussed. That's the document we looked at. And then you say this: as I recall, other potential ways of distributing the money had been considered, including the option of dividing the reserves equally between the beneficiaries. However, we were advised by the Chief Executive that this would not meet the definition of charitable need, and the board agreed with this analysis. A flat distribution of charitable funds would not meet the definition of charitable need, and then reference made to the MFET. Now, is it right to understand from this that this particular piece of advice emanated from the Chief Executive rather than being a specific piece of legal advice?
The Chief Executive taken legal advice around the options. As I say, I don't recall specific legal advice being tabled at that point. I do recall a discussion on the board on the issue.
And then we can see that the issue that's being discussed there is flat distribution. It doesn't appear that any consideration was given as to whether some kind of banded distribution might be a relatively straightforward and permissible way of dispersing the reserves to beneficiaries. Would that be right?
I think that's right.
If we just look at MACF 50288019, MACF 5028_019. So it's board meeting 26th of March 2018. If we just go to the last page, please, Shamik. The very last paragraph at the bottom of the page. We can see their reference to a deed of gift from the Skipton Fund, gifting the Mcfarland Trust their assets on closure. Can you recall what those assets comprised from the Skipton Fund?
So with the other closures, it certainly wasn't money as far as I'm aware. It may well have been items in the office, but I'm afraid I don't fully recall.
And then if we go to MACF 5028_018, we've already looked at this, the minutes of the meeting on the 29th of January 2018. If we can now look at the bottom 2 paragraphs, you'll see reference there to the Honeycomb Memorial Fund and the Wilson Empowerment Fund. We can see there a decision taken to run a one-off time-limited grants programme to disperse the remaining 40,000 or so in the Honeycomb Fund. And then in relation to the Wilson Fund, of which there was a much smaller amount left, 1,485, that would be apportioned across applications that met the studying and improvement criteria. As far as you can recall, was the small Wilson Fund amount fully apportioned out?
I can't recall. I can recall the Honeycomb Fund wasn't.
No, that's right. And then I think if we go to MACF 5028_056, and we go to so it's minutes of a meeting November 2018. If we go to the 3rd page, under the heading Honeycomb Fund, following receipt of an unrestricted donation, trustees have designated this fund to provide support to widows and bereaved partners without children to achieve social financial independence. And then there's reference to the final grants programme, but an outstanding balance of £27,000. And we can see they were added to the general reserves, which is the inquiry understands it were then transferred to the Terrence Higgins Trust. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Why was the remaining 27,000 not distributed to widows and bereaved partners?
For the same reason that we didn't choose that course of action with the main fund. By this stage, we wouldn't have been able to in the time we had left, and it was, it was a way to ensure this money would carry on and be available in the future.
We can take that down, thank you. Penultimate topic I have is in relation to the transfer of the loans to the Terrence Higgin Trust. Now, we can, if necessary, go through the documents to look at timings, but I'm hoping I can do it slightly more swiftly without the documents in relation to that. There's just one document I want to ask you to look at, MACF 5061_012. And if we go to your letter 30th of November 2017 to Elsa White, if we go to the third page, bottom of the third page. Sorry, it's Ms. Barlow's letter, not your letter. Under the heading Other, only the Mcfarland Trust has made loans to beneficiaries. And then you say she says in the third line, it's likely they will be assigned to another third sector organisation so that when the loans are eventually repaid, the funds received can be used for the benefit of the Trust's beneficiary community. Please note that this information is not in the public domain. We will write to the small number of beneficiaries affected when a decision has formally been made. Do we correctly understand that the Department of Health was informed of the Trust's direction of travel in terms of its thinking some time before beneficiaries were told?
That would seem correct, yes.
Why was that?
To the best of my recollection, the feeling was that with still great uncertainty about the final outcome on that loans and nothing changing in the interim, that actually it would cause more angst and concern than sending a letter saying we may or may not do this.
Is this correct that there was no consultation with the beneficiaries concerned prior to the Trust making the decision that what it would do would be to transfer the loans to the Terrence Higgins Trust?
That is correct.
And why was that? There was only a small number of beneficiaries, so it can't have been a problem of timing. Why not consult with those most directly affected?
Because, again, that's a good question. I'm not entirely sure why there was no consultation, apart from returning to the original issue that there was a feeling until there was certainty about what we were going to do that there was nothing really to consult on.
And I think it's right, we can look at the letters if need be, but you received letters, I think, from the Minister, Jackie Doyle-Price, expressing concern about the continuing uncertainty governing the outstanding MFT loans and the impact of that uncertainty upon the affected beneficiaries.
Indeed, I did, yes.
Were any steps taken to alleviate that uncertainty in relation to the beneficiaries that you can recall?
Well, yes. The steps we're taking were to, as quickly as possible, resolve the outstanding issues about the reserves and the loans and have the final solution that we could communicate.
What, if any, consideration was given to the privacy of those who had taken loans which were secured on their properties, and the fact that the Terrence Higgins Trust would become the registered charge holder on Land Registry Office copy entries?
There was thorough legal advice taken around what information could and should be communicated to enable THT to take on the loans, and I think no more than that information was transferred.
Forgive me, that's not quite the question I asked, but the fault may be mine. I understand that advice was taken about what information might need to be transferred about the beneficiary to the Terrence Higgins Trust. My question is a slightly different one. Terrence Higgins Trust is synonymous with HIV.
Yeah.
And so the Terrence Higgins Trust would now become the registered charge holder on land registry office copy entries, which may be publicly accessible documents. Was any consideration given to the impact of that on beneficiaries?
I don't think that issue was seen at the time.
You're aware that the Terrence Higgins Trust wrote off all the remaining loans?
I am aware, yes.
Which is something that the Mcfarland Trust had decided not to do. I'm not going to take you to the detailed advice that the Terrence Higgins Trust took and accepted in relation to that, unless you want me to, but I know you've been sent it. Do you have any reflections on that? With hindsight, do you think that that's the course that the Mcfarland Trust should have taken?
I think this is an incredibly difficult issue that I certainly struggled with, and I believe the board struggled with, in terms of balancing individuals' perception of fairness with our sense of a communal fairness, which is that only a number of individuals have ever had access to the loans. Lots of people hadn't. And just as importantly, a lot of people already repaid loans. So how would they feel if other people were having them written off? I can't speak for the board, the THT's final decision, but of course it's starting from a completely different place with different parameters and a different organisation. And I would say that I would understand their decision.
Final issue from me for now is just to see whether you can assist us with what at first blush might look like a discrepancy in the figures. If we go to MACF 40263, please, Shumik. So this is the annual financial report for the cessation period ended the 31st of January 2019, which, as I understand it, is when the trust finally closed. Could we go to page 11? This is the statement of financial activities for the cessation period. And if we look further down the page, you'll see on the left-hand side, funds transferred to the Terrence Higgins Trust, £1,160,620. So if you just keep that figure in your head for a moment, please, Mr. Murray. And then if we go to the Terrence Higgins Trust Annual Report 2019, so Shumik, that's RLIT 40493. And if we go to page 70, so it's not very easy to read. So these are the Terrence Higgins Trust consolidated financial statements as at the 31st of March 2019. And if you look, it's in alphabetical order. So if you look down the list, you'll get to Mcfarland Trust. And if you read across, you'll see the figure is 841,000. And a question's been raised, which I've been asked to explore with you, as to whether you're able to assist with why there's a difference. Does that reflect the loans, or is there some other reason?
I would assume that reflects the way they treated the loans is different to the way we treated them, because that 1.16 figure is all the assets that we made over, which includes the loans. I think the loans were in the region of £300,000 off the top of my head, so that would explain it. But I think you probably need to speak to the accountants at either end to verify.
Thank you. So those are the questions I have for Mr. Murray, but obviously we need to give call participants and their legal representatives the opportunity to suggest any further
we'll take a break. We'll say not before 25 to 5. That gives you at least 20 minutes. The reason why I'm putting it that way is it's possible that there may be more questions for Ms. Richards to garner and consider before than 20 minutes would allow. So we'll just say not before, and we'll come back as soon as she's ready after that. I imagine it probably will be 25 to 5. See you then. You mustn't discuss the evidence you have given with anyone in the interim.
Thank you.